on other causes as they continue to have that freedom. However, these illegal occupations and blockages have been intimidating, harassing, and pose an ongoing threat to Canada's security and Canada's economy. They do not aim to contribute to a public debate, but rather to dominate it through intimidation and physical force. These actions are beyond what any free and democratic society should be expected to tolerate. It bears repeating. The Emergencies Act cannot be invoked to respond to peaceful protest, which is protected by our Charter, nor even to respond to unlawful protests that can, in the ordinary course, be controlled by provincial or local authorities. But the organized occupations and blockages in multiple places across our country in recent weeks bear no resemblance to peaceful protest and go well beyond the kinds of civil disobedience that we've seen in other contexts. The emergency measures are carefully tailored to the underlying objective of responding to the national emergency and restoring public order. While some of these measures, notably those set out in the second regulation promulgated pursuant to the Declaration, may engage privacy rights under the Charter, and I should add that the terms of the Privacy Act still apply, the measures are designed to strike a reasonable balance between privacy and the objective of addressing the public order emergency. And finally, the Act does not oust the jurisdiction or limit the jurisdiction of the court to address claims that rights and freedoms were infringed. Indeed, as we know, there already are proceedings that have been initiated to that effect.
The second issue I wish to raise concerns the geographic scope of the proclamation and the measures, and the fact that several provincial premiers are opposed to the application of the Act in their province. The Act is federal legislation. Therefore, it has a legal application across the country. However, the government has been very clear that not all of the measures available under the Act will be used, and that the measures that are used will only be used when they are needed.
Canadians in towns, cities, and provinces where there are no ongoing blockades or occupations will likely see nothing arising from the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Even in places where there are ongoing occupations, if municipal and provincial law enforcement do not require federal assistance or the additional tools provided under the Emergencies Act to restore order, they need not use them. The ultimate goal for the government is to end all the illegal occupations and blockades. Local and provincial authorities were unable to resolve these incidents in the weeks leading up to the declaration of a public order emergency. Since the intention to declare a public order emergency was announced, many situations have been successfully resolved, both in Ottawa, where police used the emergency powers explicitly and effectively, and elsewhere, where perhaps the invocation of the Emergencies Act sent a message to some participants that it was time to go home. This is good news. This is the Act achieving its intended purpose. The third issue concerns the measures surrounding the funding of unlawful activities. Temporary measures under the Emergencies Act direct Canadian financial institutions to review their relationships with anyone actively participating or actively supporting the illegal occupations and blockades. On a temporary basis, a bank or other financial service provider can immediately freeze or suspend an account without a court order. In so doing, they are protected against civil liability for actions taken in good faith. And this order covers both personal and corporate accounts. To quote Michael Kempa again, quote, "The freezing of accounts motivated a huge number of people to leave, and it couldn't be done without the Emergencies Act," close quote. The actions in Ottawa may be the best example, but it is by no means the only example of the need for funding in order to continue and maintain a blockade or a long-term incursion. Those individuals or businesses that contribute to illegal occupations and prolong the illegality will and should suffer the consequences. Moreover, crowdfunding and payment service providers being used to raise funds for the protest must register with the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre, FINTRAC, Canada's main monitor for money laundering and terrorist financing, and they must report large and suspicious transactions. While this is a temporary measure, the government has signaled that it intends to introduce legislation to apply FINTRAC reporting requirements to crowdfunding platforms on a permanent basis. Also, under the emergency orders, federal government institutions may share relevant information about persons and entities participating and supporting unlawful assemblies with banks and other financial service providers where it will help stop the funding of illegal activities under the regulations. Following the money is an important step that will help put an end to these illegal blockades and protests. The questions have been raised about how these measures will be applied and what protections or safeguards exist to protect Canadians who have had their bank accounts frozen or their insurance suspended. The order requires financial service providers to review on an ongoing basis whether their customers are participating in or funding unlawful assemblies. The intent is that if you stop participating in the protest, the bank unfreezes your account. This is meant to incentivize people to stop making contributions or to drive their truck away from a blockade and go home. As such, it is in the government's interest for those who make that sensible choice to have their account unfrozen quickly. Colleagues, these temporary financial measures are not being applied indiscriminately. Let me quote the February 21st, 2022 RCMP statement on the freezing of financial accounts. Quote, under the Emergency Economic Measures Order, Emergencies Act, the list that was provided to financial institutions included identities of individuals who were influencers in the illegal protest in Canada and owners and or drivers of vehicles who did not want to leave the area impacted by the protest. At no time did we provide a list of donors to financial institutions. We are now working with the banks to build a process to address the accounts that were frozen. Close quote. Now, if someone feels that a mistake has been made or believes they are being treated unjustly, there are a number of steps that they can take. First, they can reach out directly to their bank or to police to demonstrate that they're no longer participating in a blockade. And this alone should be enough to have their account unfrozen. If there's an exceptional case where that doesn't work, the person can make a complaint to the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. And ultimately, Canadians have recourse to the courts. But it's highly unlikely that this will be necessary. The purpose of this short-term emergency order is for people to have their accounts frozen while they're actively participating in the blockades, and to have them unfrozen as soon as their participation stops. Importantly, these measures related to bank accounts do not apply retroactively. Let me be clear. This order does not apply to people who made donations or who participated in the blockades before February 15th. It's worth noting, colleagues, that as of Sunday, some 200 bank accounts have been frozen out of tens of thousands of donors and participants. So it certainly does not appear that this measure is being overused. Finally, let me address the concern that the invocation of the Emergency Act sets a dangerous precedent for future governments who might be tempted to use it to shut down Indigenous protests or protests by environmental activists. The Emergency Act has been on the books since 1988, and this is the first time it has been invoked. As the Prime Minister has said many times this past week, it is not a tool of first resort or second, it's a tool of last resort. Of course, there is no way to predict what a future government might do in the face of a perceived national emergency. But if the Act is invoked, all actions must be consistent with the constitutionally protected rights guaranteed by the Charter, and the courts will be there to protect those whose rights and freedoms may be infringed. Equally importantly, the Act requires rigorous democratic oversight if it is invoked, and ongoing oversight and review even after the temporary measures it authorized are no longer in effect. And it is to these democratic mechanisms that I now turn. A distinguishing feature of the Emergency Act is the comprehensive way in which it contemplates and structures parliamentary oversight and review of all stages in the process once a government declares the existence of a national emergency. The first step is the one with which we are seized. Under Section 58 of the Act, both the Senate and the House of Commons must begin debate on a motion to confirm the declaration within 7 days after its issuance. And as stated at the outset, the legal test is whether the government had reasonable grounds to believe that a public order emergency exists, necessitating the imposition of special temporary measures for dealing with the emergency, if either the House or the Senate emergency. If either the House or the Senate votes not to confirm the declaration is revoked effective that day, and all the measures previously authorized cease to be in force. But that is not all. The Act also provides parliamentarians the tools to move that a declaration of emergency be revoked even after having initially confirmed it, as set out in Section 59 of the Act. At any time after the declaration of a national emergency, a motion seeking the revocation of a declaration of emergency, if signed by 10 senators or 20 members of the House, may be filed with the Speaker. And that motion must be taken up and considered within 3 days after the motion is filed. Colleagues, this provides parliamentarians the ability to challenge the continuation of the emergency measures if they deem the emergency to have passed. A similar power is granted with respect to orders or regulations made pursuant to a declaration. With the exception of those orders or regulations exempt from publication in the Canada Gazette by regulations made under the Statutory Instruments Act, all orders and regulations must be laid before each House of Parliament within 2 sitting days after they're promulgated. Section 61 of the Act provides a process whereby a motion to revoke or amend a regulation or order must be filed with the Speaker and taken up within 3 sitting days. In these ways, the Act provides further recourse for parliamentarians to reconsider whether the emergency measures should continue and to vote to terminate them even before the 30-day period elapses. Furthermore, if the government wishes to extend the state of emergency beyond the 30-day limit prescribed in the Act, Section 60 provides that the extension must be confirmed by both the Senate and the House in the same manner and within the same time frames as when it was invoked initially. But there's even more. Section 63 of the Act also provides for the establishment of a parliamentary review committee of both Houses of Parliament to review the declaration of emergency and to report back to both Houses of Parliament. This committee has the responsibility to report the results of its review at least once every 60 days while the declaration of emergency is in force. However, in cases where there is a motion for the revocation of the declaration, it must report to Parliament within 3 days. Where a proclamation continuing the declaration is issued, or where a declaration has expired or been revoked, the committee must report within 7 sitting days. The review and reporting functions of this committee are crucial to enhance democratic accountability. This will allow senators and our colleagues in the House to stay apprised of how decisions were made, to assess what worked and what didn't, to reflect upon the lessons learned, and to inform future actions. The roles and responsibilities of this committee also provide ongoing oversight of the measures taken pursuant to the declaration. For example, where a regulation or order is exempted from publication in the Canada Gazette, that order or regulation shall be referred to the committee within 2 days after it is made, or if the committee has not yet been constituted, within the first 2 sitting days after it is designated or established. Should this be the case, the committee will have 30 days to amend or revoke them. Amend or revoke them. This is another mechanism to ensure ongoing democratic review and oversight of the measures taken under a declaration of emergency. And I wish at this time to advise this chamber that there currently are no orders or regulations expected to be made that would be referred to that committee, meaning that have not been deposited or would be deposited publicly before both houses of Parliament. The Act is silent as to when the Parliamentary Review Committee is to be established. That said, the establishment of the committee would follow the usual rules for standing up joint committees. Accordingly, if the declaration of emergency is confirmed, I will be working with my counterpart in the House to move as quickly as possible to get the committee constituted. Now, regarding membership on the committee, the Act is silent as to its size, nor does it say how many members should be senators and how many members should be members of the House of Commons. Section 62(1) provides only that the committee shall include, quote, at least one member of the House of Commons from each party that has a recognized membership of 12 or more persons in that House, and at least one senator from each party in the Senate that is represented on the committee by a member of the House of Commons, close quote. It does not preclude the naming of additional categories of members, whether from the House or the Senate. After the expiration, without extension, or the revocation of the Act, Section 63(1) states, and I quote, the Governor and Council shall, within 60 days after the expiration or revocation of a declaration of emergency, cause an inquiry to be held into the circumstances that led to the declaration being issued and the measures taken for dealing with the emergency. Close quote. Colleagues, the questions and the concerns leading up to the invocation of the Emergencies Act are far too numerous to list, and many are not even yet known. But Section 63(1) will allow a committee to thoroughly investigate the how, the who, the what, the when, and the why leading up to the decision. How did this movement begin and gain momentum? Who coordinated and organized the protest? What was the catalyst for its inception? When did the anger explode, and why was the illegal response of blockades and occupations considered the remedy? The actions of governments at all levels, as well as the actions or inactions of law enforcement, will also need review. This review will begin within 60 days of the termination of the order, and a report must be tabled within 360 days after study begins. The Emergencies Act was passed in 1988, long before the composition of the Senate changed. It is the position of the government that all recognized parliamentary groups in the Senate should have at least one member on the Parliamentary Review Committee. As a matter of course, the expectation is that the committee will generally conduct its meetings in public. This committee, like all committees, can meet in private, but would usually only do so to consider draft reports or if confidential information is involved. The committee is only required to meet in private if it is considering orders or regulations that cannot be published in the Gazette. Let me turn to my closing remarks. Canada is a country founded on the principles of peace, order, and good government. Canadians expect government to protect our economy, the rule of law, our values, and most importantly, the safety and security of our people.
Honourable Senators, every senator who wishes to speak to this matter will have an opportunity to do so. If while a senator is speaking, there's a matter comes up that you want to question or you disagree with, please just take note of it, and when the opportunity arises, you can ask a question or you can speak to it yourself. Otherwise, please show some courtesy to senators who have the floor. Senator Gold.
Thank you, Your Honour. We select our government through democratic elections, not through threats or use of force. We respect and protect each other as we have done throughout these last 2 challenging years. And when we disagree, we say so, loudly, boisterously, sometimes angrily. We march, we chant, we wave banners, we vote. Sometimes we push the bounds of the law, and we know that there may be consequences for that. Allow me to quote the Prime Minister, who yesterday said the following: and I quote, "In a democracy, you can protest and you can share your opinion at the top of your lungs. You can disagree with elected officials, and you can definitely disagree with me. But you can't harass your fellow Canadians who disagree with you. You can't hold a city hostage. You can't block a critical trade corridor and deprive people of their jobs. You can't attack journalists for reporting, which is essential to our democracy. What you can do is vote. What you can do is run for office. That's how change happens in a democracy." Close quote. When we're at our best, we listen to each other, all resolved to listen more and listen better. But on that point, though, this weekend, as police were advancing, one of the demonstrators was saying on TV that he only came to Ottawa to engage in dialogue. If only someone would have dialogued with him. Well, perhaps that individual did come here in good faith. But on the whole, to the question of whether this could have been de-escalated through discussion, when you show up waving banners, directing profanity at the Prime Minister, calling him for him to be jailed, and explicitly demanding the overthrow of a democratically elected government, that is a curious way to signal interest in constructive conversation. Organized activities designed to destabilize our democracy have been underway across this country for weeks. They are coordinated, well-funded, and persistent. Many participants have been prepared to use unlawful means and violence to achieve their ends. There is no reason to assume that those behind this movement have abandoned their plans to disrupt and destabilize our country. We cannot let this continue. The temporary measures put in place under the Emergency Act have already made a material difference in restoring order. While the use of the Act is extraordinary, the measures themselves are not extreme. They have been designed and used in a focused and a proportionate manner, and they have been effective. But even though calm is being returned to the streets of Ottawa, the need for these temporary measures remains. We need to let police and other authorities finish the work that these measures have allowed them to undertake. And you get the feeling that the people of Ottawa understand this all too well. On Sunday, for the first time in almost a month, the residents and workers of downtown, our hosts when we come here to the Senate, were able to walk around their neighborhoods feeling, I'm searching for the word, free. But not quite feeling safe, not yet. On Friday, Ottawa's emergency lines were deliberately jammed once again. On Saturday, the Ottawa hospital went into lockdown because of a bomb threat. And a number of demonstrators have regrouped down the highway and are vowing to return. As one man told La Presse, et je cite, "C'est pas fini."
And I quote, "It isn't over. As soon as we can, we'll go back."
Obviously, the emergency measures we're debating are temporary. They'll have to end before long. But it's only been a couple of days since a phalanx of police officers from across the country were required to uproot a siege in this city. Police are saying that they need a bit more time to consolidate the work they did this weekend, and I think we should give it to them. Honourable colleagues, I humbly ask for your support to confirm the declaration of emergency that is put before you. Thank you for your kind attention.
Senator Gold, there are a number of senators who wish to ask questions. Are you prepared to take some questions?
Of course.
Hey, Senator Plett.
Thank you, Your Honor, and I have a number of questions, so I'll ask one or two as you allow, and then ask to be put back on the list for questions later. Senator Gold, you said the government had been very clear. The government has been anything but very clear. Yesterday, I guess, I asked you a straightforward question in question period about invoking the Emergencies Act. Instead of answering the question yesterday, you said you look forward to answering it during Tuesday's debate. So here's my second attempt, Senator Gold. When the Prime Minister invoked the Emergencies Act, he claimed it would be geographically targeted. In the other place on Saturday, the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Justice confirmed that the legislation applies to all of Canada. Senator Gold, what guidelines did the Trudeau government use before making the call to declare a historic national emergency throughout our entire country? Do you have an answer to that question directly today, Senator Gold?
Gold.
Well, thank you for your question. I did indeed address all the circumstances underlying the government's decision to declare this a national emergency affecting the whole country in my speech, and I'm glad for the opportunity to reinforce a number of points. It is not simply that there were activities in many provinces of the country that caused serious harm to our economy and represented threats to people and security, and I will not repeat what those were. The activities took place with the participation of individuals and groups from across this country. They were funded by individual and groups not only across this country, but beyond, elsewhere in other countries. These measures and the ongoing threats for them to continue affected our borders whether in border crossings in Surrey, border crossings in Alberta, border crossings in Manitoba, threat and indications of possible border crossing protests or border protests for Saskatchewan. Clearly, we know what happened here in Ottawa, concerns about border crossings. Frankly, it is clear that all the country is potentially affected by this movement that has hijacked legitimate and understandable concerns and frustrations with the impact of the pandemic. Moreover, and this is really critical, if you examine exactly how these measures are being applied in the last week, they are being applied only where they're needed, only where the local authorities have said, we need these additional tools, whether it's the police in particular jurisdictions, or in some cases, premiers who've asked for assistance. That's where you see the actions being taken on the ground, nowhere else. And so in that regard, though a federal law applying to the whole country, because the whole country is at risk from the events that gave rise to the blockades on the bridges, that gave rise to the occupation and siege of Ottawa, is an incontrovertible fact, and the government had reasonable grounds to believe that that was the case. And at the same time, using the targeted, focused measures contemplated by the Emergencies Act, being true to the letter and spirit of the Emergencies Act, only actions taken where they're absolutely needed in coordination with local authorities, whether governmental or police, are being taken, and no other actions will be taken.
Yes, one supplementary, if I could, Speaker, and then, as I said earlier, there are a lot of people that want to ask questions, so I'll go on a list for a little later. You know, Senator Gold, you'll excuse some of us if we just simply don't believe the rhetoric that we are being given by the government, both in the other place and here. On Saturday, the Minister of Public Safety said at least 76 bank accounts had been frozen under the Emergencies Act. This action took place before the House of Commons and the Senate, before the House of Commons and the Senate had the opportunity to weigh in whether this instance of invoking the Emergency Act is necessary. Yesterday afternoon, David Aiken reported new information he received from Public Safety Canada that 208 financial products have been frozen. Senator Gold, you referred to that in your speech as well, and you seem to think that is not real significant and that people can somehow get this unfrozen in due course. We all know that this could take weeks and even months to get this done, and somebody cannot move, somebody cannot operate. Leader, what are the specific guidelines, the very specific guidelines, Leader, not the government thinking somebody may have done something nefarious? What are the specific guidelines are being used to determine if a bank account should be frozen? When we freeze the mafia's bank account, we have to get a court order. You can't freeze their bank account. When you have a murderer out on bail, you don't freeze their bank account. We have people that are avoiding taxes. You don't freeze their bank accounts without court orders. So what are the specific guidelines or criteria that are being used to determine if a bank account should be frozen, as well as what guidelines or criteria are being used to determine which type of accounts or financial products can be seized?
Senator Gold.
Well, thank you. There are a number of questions that you've asked. With regard to the very first, the Act is enforced the minute it is proclaimed. But unlike the War Measures Act, Parliament is required to confirm within the time, and that's what we're seized with. And the nature of an emergency is such that you have to respond to the emergency. The unique and appropriate measures set out in the Emergencies Act passed in 1988 by the Mulroney government is such that it provides, unlike the War Measures Act, for democratic oversight and judicial review. With regard to your comments about the number of bank accounts, again, as I mentioned in my speech, and I was trying to be as up-to-date as possible, yes, there have been 200 or so accounts frozen. I don't take any of them lightly, but they do represent a tiny proportion of the number of donations and therefore potential bank accounts that have been implicated. And as I will repeat, the focus is on those who are continually participating, or who are actively participated and continuing to participate in either in the funding and support of illegal activities as of February 15th. So the criteria and the banks and police authorities are entitled to share information. The banks, as they do in have done in other circumstances, are required to review their accounts to ensure that the monies that are there are not being used to fund and support illegal activities proscribed or prohibited under the Act. The difference between this situation, colleagues, and any others is that we're dealing with a national emergency where the security of Canada is at risk, where funds, whether Canadian or American, are being used and to support and maintain a movement that, as I've tried to, done my best to explain, and as the government explains in the declaration that was a document that was tabled yesterday, that undermine the security of Canada, the security of Canadians in our economy, and that cannot otherwise be dealt with in ordinary means, and require temporary measures to address the emergency.
Senator Housakis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the government leader take the question? Government leader, I think you will agree that the country has never been at a lower stage in our history than we have been over the last few weeks. I listened to your speech very attentively, and my questions are as follows. Would you not agree that we've had many, many protests in the history of this country, many protests that weren't at the scale of this protest, but a lot more violent than this, but yet we've never seen any Prime Minister refuse to dialogue, to speak to these frustrated Canadian citizens, Canadian taxpayers. On the contrary, instead of speaking to them, he spoke down to them. Will you also agree that it's the responsibility of the Prime Minister to be measured when you have frustrated mobs out in the streets who are not happy with their government, not to call them names, not to stoke the flames of division, as he seems to do on a regular basis? We've been around politics for a long time. I've been around politics for a long time. We've seen many prime ministers and governments use wedge issues, but I've never in my life, in my 37 years of active politics, seen a prime minister double down, triple down, go to any limits rather than to calm the situation. At the end of the day, and I saw it in your speech today, we've seen the Prime Minister on a couple of occasions call protesters in this country, taxpayers, Canadian citizens, marchers with the swastika, defenders of Nazism. He's used those terms. He sat up in the House of Commons and he actually proclaimed to a child of Holocaust survivors, a member of Parliament duly elected, that she's a defender of the swastika. He said that in the House of Commons, that she marches. You and the opposite benches who march with the swastikas. I'm allowed in debate, as you know, Senator, down to make my point. And I did get up on a question, and you're not the speaker last I checked. So the question here is very simple, government leader. It's very simple. Do you agree with Prime Minister Trudeau that any parliamentarian and anybody who took the time to listen to these protesters, to take their calls, to meet with them, that we're Nazis, we're supporters of the swastika? Is that a view you share, a view that the Prime Minister has expressed publicly and refuses to apologize for?
Senator Gold.
Well, thank you for your comments and for the question. I did not say, and I'm not asserting, that anything of the sort. The fact is, and it is a matter of public record, that not only at the beginning of this protest in Ottawa, but indeed towards even through the course of it, there were representations by people with an expression. It is a matter of public record, if I may continue, that at the beginning and even to the end, there were the display of signs that were intimidating, harassing, racist, ugly, and unacceptable. To your question, I do not agree with your characterizations of the Prime Minister's actions. I will not. I'm really trying hard, colleagues, to be factual and clear and not to get drawn into what is clearly an anger at the Prime Minister, a frustration with this government, and legitimately partisan rhetoric from others. So I'm not going to talk about what it must feel like to a father to be looking at signs, and I won't repeat the ugliness of some of the signs, calling for him or describing him. That's not what I want to say. I simply want to say that the Prime Minister and the government took very seriously its obligations under the law, thought long and hard about whether or not this crisis could be managed without invoking the Emergencies Act, consulted, reviewed, took advice from intelligence and police officers, and reluctantly came to the decision that there was no other way to resolve this crisis. And with regard to your question about the tone or measured, actions speak louder than words, colleagues. The actions on the ground in Ottawa, the intimidation of healthcare workers, of people of color, of people wearing masks, the need to provide police protection for ordinary citizens of Canada is not a measured response to COVID-19 restrictions or mandates. But the measures put in place on the ground, not in the abstract, but on the ground by the Government of Canada to address this were measured, proportionate, and we saw this with our own eyes here in Ottawa. So to your questions, honourable colleague, no, I do not agree with your characterization of the Prime Minister's actions, and the Government of Canada stands convinced that the measures that it took reluctantly were necessary to secure the peace, order, and good government of Canada.
Senator Housakis.
Senator Gold, I would appreciate it if you stop always belittling questions from the opposition as partisan. We have as much right to partisan questions as you have the right to partisan answers. That's what we do in Parliament. So can we cut this nonsense about what we do is more partisan and somehow what you do is God's work here? It has to stop at some point. There has to be some respect. Well, you made an inference that somehow my questions are partisan in tone, and you do that constantly. Well, your answers are partisan in tone, Senator Gold. Excuse me, but I'm entitled to that opinion. Furthermore, I'm also entitled to my opinion that these protesters have been, and every single time we've had protests in this country, you have a group of extremists that try to tag along. And this is what has happened particularly in this case. But again, for a prime minister to smear everybody with one brush and call these protesters, millions across Canada, Nazis, which he did, and people who march with swastikas, again, is categorically false. And I don't agree with your premise, because I took the time last week to walk up and down and speak to protesters. They went out of their way to be measured in their protest. But my next question, Senator Gold, has to do with your speech where you said that the Measures Act only affects these particular protesters, doesn't affect all other Canadians. Last I checked in the last 2 days, to get past military-style checkpoints here in Ottawa, to get to my job here, I had to provide ID, and I had to provide proof of exclusion to the police. Who determines, who's given that list to the police and those checkpoints of who have the right to that exclusion to enter the downtown Ottawa area? And I remind everybody, the downtown Ottawa area includes Parliament Hill. And maybe it's gone absent to parliamentarians here, but this is the first time in the history of this country that the Parliament Hill of Canada has been closed to Canadian citizens. Never before. When Parliament was under attack a few years ago, under attack, where we had a violent attack, the speakers at the time refused to shut down Parliament Hill with all kinds of pressure from the RCMP. We said it's a fundamental right for Canadians. So don't say in your speech that the measures only affect the protesters. It affects every citizen. Anybody who wants to come to Parliament Hill today to speak to the parliamentarians about what's happening in the Ukraine or anywhere else in the country, they can't. So don't say in your speech it only affects the protesters. It affects each and every Canadian that wants to come here to protest on Parliament Hill.
Sorry, Senator Housakis. This is for all senators who wish to ask questions. Senators are obviously aware that you can only speak to this matter once. So when you're asking questions, please don't use that as a platform to get in a second or a third speech. Senator Gold.
Of course, they're important issues, and that's why we're debating them. And just for the record, I did not say you didn't have the right to be partisan in your questions. I said that it was challenging to respond to serious questions on serious matters. May I continue? I said what I said in my speech, and I stand by what I said. Of course, the fact that the police have had to continue to, for the time being, to set up checkpoints are clearly designed to make sure that those who haven't expressed their intention to return when they can, as I quoted in my speech, are not able to. And yes, of course, having to show ID, as I did this morning, walking from my apartment in Centertown to here, is an inconvenience, so I am affected. This is a proportional and an acceptable limit on my otherwise ability to continue to walk with my hands in my pockets, as compared. Well, and if I may finish the sentence, and then I will continue my answer. As compared to the impossibility of residents of Centertown, however old, young, single, or with families, to leave their houses out of fear of being assaulted, harassed, intimidated, and slurred by those occupying the streets. There was one last point that I might ask you to interrupt me so that I can answer that last question, Senator Housakis. There was some last point, but if it comes to me, I will say it after.
Senator Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Senator Gold, my question is to you, and there is a certain amount of trust us in the government's justification for these extreme measures we are debating today. but this comes at a time when trust in governments at all levels clearly is eroding on the part of many citizens. I know that this order is based on a perceived threat to the security of Canada, but yesterday in a briefing for senators, Public Safety Minister Mendicino referred to matters within his knowledge which could not be shared. You've told us today that the review committee could meet in private if confidential information is required. So my question is this: will the review committee have access to unredacted security information required to do their job of, as you put it, seriously investigating the justification for this order?
Gold.
Well, that's a very good question. I think the short answer is no. The Parliamentary Review Committee will not be required to have the level of security clearance necessary to review confidential security information. We have an institution, NCCOP, where the members are cleared and do have access to such information, and that is where information of that kind, where on an as-need basis, is shared with those members. I was referring, Senator Patterson, to those regulations that by law are not to be published in the Gazette, but to make sure that all regulations, even those under the Statutory Instruments Act that are exempted from publication, are nonetheless reviewed by this committee, which will be, if I recall, has to take an oath of secrecy, but does not otherwise have the security clearance that would be required for intelligence information to be shared. I hope that answers your question.
Senator Patterson, do you have a supplementary?
Yes, if I may, Mr. Speaker. Senator Gold, thank you for a clear answer to my question, but it does concern me. You said that the review committee set up under Section 63(1) will be empowered to seriously investigate the justification for this order, and yet you've just said that the committee will not have access to unredacted security information. So I wonder how you can say that the review committee will have the power to seriously investigate, that those were your words, when you've just said that certain matters will not be available to the committee.
Senator Gold.
No, well, let me thank you for the question. Let me be clear. There are a number of processes in place under the Emergency Act, both to review on an ongoing basis and to report after the fact, and that's the review committee. And it'll have certain powers appropriate for the task, largely to consider whether the emergency or the regulations promulgated under it should be revoked or regulations amended, and that is the important task, as well as reporting back to Parliament on a regular basis if the emergency carries on. There's also an inquiry contemplated in the Act as well to do a, dare I say, a post-mortem on the situation and report back. But colleagues, we know very well, and this is not a feature of the Emergencies Act, that we accept that in a democratic society, there is nonetheless categories of information that cannot be made public and should not be made public. Ongoing police investigations, the sharing of intelligence information between agencies, whether it's CSIS, the RCMP, or the communications establishment. Information shared between governments. It has always been the case, and we have very well-established laws, National Defense Act, the Evidence Act, that provide a structure for when these matters may be shared or not shared, and indeed even legal processes and administrative processes for fine-tuning decisions and challenging decisions when information is being withheld on national security grounds. There's nothing new here. And I will also remind this House, if you search the Hansard and all of the public statements of this government has not stood up and said, hey, trust us, but we can't tell you anything that's going on. The declaration that was filed in this place, the statements and in my speech, outline a sufficient number of publicly known facts on the public record, that in the opinion of the government, more than clearly satisfied the legal test that the government had reasonable grounds to believe that a national emergency was such that these measures needed to be, that the Act needed to be invoked and these measures put in place.
Senator Batters.
Thank you. Senator Gold, Section 62 of the Emergencies Act sets up the, quote, Parliamentary Review Committee. This will be an important accountability mechanism to review how these unprecedented powers have been used. And it is a joint parliamentary committee, and its membership is set out at Section 62(2) of the Act, as you read out in your speech, and indicates that at least one senator from each party in the Senate that is represented on the committee by a member of the House of Commons. Well, Senator Gold, I guess the fake nomenclature in the Prime Minister's independent Senate has come home to roost, because right now the only senators who will be able to be members of that committee prescribed by the Emergencies Act are Conservative Party of Canada senators. So I guess my Conservative Senate caucus colleagues and I will have to fill this committee with only Conservative senators. And that's because we don't have any Liberal senators, NDP senators, or Bloc Québécois senators. Senator Gold, your party and your government, I should say, has been in power for 6.5 years. Your attempt to amend the Parliament of Canada Act, first introduced almost a year ago here as Bill S4, now just starting in the House of Commons as Bill C7, has not yet been passed. And according to Section 62(6) of the Emergency Act, this Parliamentary Review Committee is supposed to report to Parliament at least every 60 days while the declaration of emergency is in effect. We've already been more than 1 week into that. So, Senator Gold, who other than Conservative senators will sit on this crucial committee? And quite frankly, Senator Gold, your government's poor planning and procrastination does not constitute our Emergencies Act escape hatch.
Senator Gold.
Well, thank you for your question. Lawyer to lawyer. The Act and the membership set out does not limit the number of members, whether of the House or the Senate, to the minimum requirements that are set out in terms of representatives of parties. This is standard statutory interpretation doctrine. The government's position is clear that a literal and contextual reading of this Act does not preclude the naming of senators or indeed members of the House that do not otherwise fall within the minimum set out. And it is for that reason that the position of the government is that the Act, as it is written, even though it was written in 1988, does not preclude the appointment of at least one member of every recognized group in the Senate.
Senator Batters.
Senator Gold, as we speak, Ukraine is at severe risk of invasion by Putin's Russia. There are 1.4 million of my fellow Canadians who are of Ukrainian descent, as I am, and we are gravely concerned. Given the invocation of the Emergencies Act and the fact that illegal public assemblies are prohibited and that Parliament Hill is designated as a protected and secure place under the Act's regulations, will Ukrainian Canadians be allowed to come to Parliament Hill this week to express their grave concerns about Russia's aggression towards Ukraine?
Senator Gold.
As the descendant of someone from the Ukraine, and I know I speak for all of us, we stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. For so long as these measures exist, so long as the Emergencies Act remains in force, if there is the ability, one of the tools is to designate certain areas as off limits for those other than who are working or residing in the area. We've already seen that the areas have been adjusted, I think notably around the Byward Market. So I cannot predict, Senator Batters, that on Tuesday, what the situation will be around the Parliament precinct on Friday or Saturday. What I can say is that all those Canadians, whether of Ukrainian origin or other, should use whatever means they have, the telephone, social media, and indeed the ability to come and protest peacefully in Ottawa. But for so long as the measures are in place to protect the parliamentary precinct from the return of illegal protests, all Canadian citizens will have to comply with the legal requirements that are in place now and that I hope will be confirmed in this chamber, but we all hope will not last for a second longer than are necessary.
Senator Deakin, Ontario.
Thank you.
Senator Batters, the list again. Senator Deakin, Ontario.
Thank you. This question is before I ask it. I just wanted to share that earlier this morning I had a chance to have breakfast with many of our police officers to thank them. And their information, their insight, they were in this journey, and that has really been quite enlightening for the debate that we are going to have today, I must say. And what I'd like to do is dig a little bit back up, take a breath, and go a little bit back to maybe 7 days ago. And what I'd like to try to do is dig a little deeper into the early stages that built us to recommendation of the EMA Act. So to our government representative, are you aware of which levels of our national security apparatus or others that were consulted and listened to when the government was considering the invocation of the Emergencies Act? In other words, what sectors were at the early table before it became premiers and ministers?
Well, thank you for your question, and you'll permit me to pause for a second as I consult the documents that the government has already provided. As the government has stated on a number of occasions, honourable colleagues, the decision was not to invoke the Act was not taken lightly, and it was taken after a series of engagements, both with law enforcement, with intelligence community, with whom it is in regular contact, as well as with municipal and provincial authorities. Furthermore, it was considered and debated and seriously in 3 separate meetings of a special cabinet committee focusing exclusively on crisis issues such as we're facing. So without being able to divulge, because I don't know the specific information that a specific agency would have shared, it wasn't shared with me because I don't have the clearance to receive that kind of information. It is nonetheless the case that the government was informed by all of the law enforcement and intelligence services upon which it relies in matters like this, and combined with its own consultations with political instances, came to that conclusion that there were reasonable grounds to believe these measures were necessary.
Yeah. Senator Deakin, Ontario.
Thank you for that. I'm really, really trying to understand those early stages, so I appreciate that. Then as we move and progress forward, is the government and will the government be relying strictly on advice from local law enforcement when deciding to revoke the EMA, Or are these national security and intelligence agencies becoming increasingly involved as this crisis drags on?
Senator Gold.
Well, again, Senator, thank you for your question. I think the fairest way that I can answer it, and the most transparent way I can answer it, is that I am assured, and I can advise this House, this chamber, that the government is monitoring the situation and consulting with all of the institutions and organizations that it has been consulting with, literally on an hourly basis. The objective of the government at this stage of the emergency, 7 days into it, is to determine when it is safe and prudent to revoke the Emergency Act. We have been told, the government has been advised, and some of this is on the public record, from police chiefs and associations, that it is not the time yet. That the government has been advised that more time is needed for law enforcement to complete the work that it's done to make sure that there is not a return, whether it's to blockages of our borders, sieges of our cities, and the like. But as the government has said on many, many, many occasions, as soon as it is possible as soon as the government concludes that the emergency no longer exists that require these measures, they will be lifted.
Senator Marshall.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Senator Gold, thank you very much for your opening remarks. You were saying in your opening remarks that government's responsible for the security of the nation. But, you know, they went from tolerating the protesters over a 3-week period to invoking the act. Like, it was a big step. They went from doing practically nothing, or what seems to be doing nothing, to invoking the act. And, you know, we all knew that the protesters were coming. We started to track them, I think, back probably mid-January. We were aware that they were coming to Ottawa, and there was there was nothing done, really. So these threats that you talked about in your opening remarks, that you said they were too numerous to mention, they didn't happen overnight. You even said yourself in your opening remarks, they were underway for weeks. But it seems like nothing was done. So my question is, we've received general explanations as to the thought process that went into invoking the act. But, you know, this is a serious step that we're contemplating here today. What exactly happened that the government decided to invoke the act? Was it something like, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time, or did something specific happen? Like, what happened? Because it seemed like for 3 or 4 weeks there was nothing. There was just tolerating it, and even in interviews, ministers were saying, "Oh, we want the protesters to go home." So what happened? Be specific. I know you're giving us generalities, and I think somebody was saying earlier, trust us. But what happened that the government decided to invoke the Emergency Act?
Senator Gold.
Well, thank you for your question. It gives me the opportunity, I think, and I won't belabor the point, to repeat some of the things that I said. We live in a federal country. The city of Ottawa is under the jurisdiction, as far as Wellington Street, of the municipality. And in terms of the highways, it's the province of Ontario. In terms of and the federal government, it has jurisdiction. What happened was, and what happened was a series of events that led to a situation of out of control, a situation where local authorities, and that includes the provincial authorities, were simply incapable of responding effectively. There will be time in the processes set out in this Act to look more comprehensively at what could have been done differently, how the police might have acted differently, how the province might have acted differently, how the federal government might have acted differently. But 3 weeks ago, the federal government, Parliament of Canada, did not have the tools, to assist local police to get the job done. And the Emergencies Act provided tools that no level of government would have been able to do, whether it's broadening the requirement tools that they had at their disposal by their provincial governments to manage the situation. So that's why the government acted. It wasn't doing nothing. It was providing ongoing support. It was providing it was an ongoing dialogue with all the relevant instances, but it reached the point where it affected the country as a whole, and that's the role of the federal government to step in under those circumstances.
Senator Marshall, did you have a supplementary?
Yes, I do. It wasn't the tools that I was concerned about with regard to having the police come in and provide assistance. What I'm focused on is the intelligence that the convoy started out 23rd. Why didn't the government know there were threats then? If there are threats, why didn't they know then? Why did it take until middle of February to know that there were threats serious enough that they have to invoke the Emergency Act? That is the question I'd like to have answered. And since it took them so long to figure it out, how much confidence can we have with regard to now, with regard to them invoking the act and also deciding when it should come to an end? Those are the concerns that I have. Could you just address that issue with regard to the assessment, the intelligence, the assessment of the threat, and why government was so late, what appears to be so late in assessing this monumental threat that they're talking about, or numerous threats?
For your question, but there's an assumption with respect, Senator Marshall, that is not correct. It is not correct to assume the government was not aware of the threats or made aware of the threats. Nor is it correct to assume that the government didn't share its concerns about the threats. What is clear, and it's equally clear, as we all know, and as I stated in response to an earlier question, that I cannot share, and the government cannot share and should not share the intelligence that it may have received that informed, that helped inform their decision. I mean, that goes without saying. Again, all of the circumstances, all of the successes, failures, or actions taken that led us to this unfortunate place will be reviewed, must be reviewed, and will be reviewed under the terms of the Act, as is appropriate in a democratic country such as Canada.
Senator Lankin.
Thank you very much, Speaker. And my question is to the government representative. I appreciate your speech. Thank you very much. And I appreciate the questions that have been raised here. Senator Patterson and Senator Batters both in their questions touched on the issue of the review committee. I've read the documents. I thought I completely understood it. In between the questions and the answers, I might have some confusion now. So my first question is to ask you to be very clear about the scope and the powers of the Parliamentary Committee versus the inquiry that will be held within 350 days.
Senator Gold.
Sure. Thank you for your question. The Parliamentary Review Committee has a general reporting function, a review function, and reporting. It also has what I would call an oversight function, because it has the ability to consider, at the request of whether senators or members of the House, the revocation of regulations or the revocation or the amendment of regulations. So it has both a review and a reporting function, as I tried to set out in my speech. I hope that answers your question.
You didn't touch on the inquiry, but
I'm sorry.
That's fine. As I understand it, then, the Parliamentary Committee, as you said, has part of its role that is more akin to oversight than review. And I would just point out that in the context of Canada, not other countries, that's quite extraordinary that there is actually a role of immediate, on top of sensitive information, not necessarily classified, oversight. So I imagined that to be one where, as actions continue and as we hear reporting of things that have happened or that powers, more to the point, under this act are reviewed and determined by that committee to be necessary or to be an overreach. For example, if there was an allegation of a charter violation, that there's an oversight function. It occurs to me that this is extraordinarily important, and we are a week or so or more into the application or the declaration of the emergency, and we do not have a committee in place and we do not have names. I understand the government House Leader in the other place is working on that and is responsible, but it seems to me, at the very least, I would have thought it would be up and running now, but at the very least, when we come to our vote tomorrow or Thursday, whenever that vote takes place, there should be a ready announcement made so that this parliamentary committee can begin immediately. If this is an emergency, if this committee is to oversee that it's being applied, the measures are being applied appropriately, that they're not in contradiction of the Charter, then that committee should be up and running. Would you tell us, please, when to expect that?
Senator Gold.
Well, thank you. It's an important question dealing with an important democratic instrument in this act. My understanding is that the constitution of the committee will require a motion in both houses of Parliament, as is the case for the standing up of special joint committees. My understanding further is that there are discussions have. I am in touch regularly with my counterpart. Obviously, the discussions I'm not going to share. But my understanding is that my counterpart, Minister Holland, is in discussions with his counterparts in the House vis-a-vis the composition and process for this. It was only last night that the House voted to confirm, and I am not aware that yet that an understanding has been reached in a minority House between all the parties in the House as to how their representation would be constituted. I have shared with this House, with this chamber, the government's position vis-a-vis the Senate, at least in terms of who should have at least one seat on that. But the discussions are ongoing, and I, like you, and the government, frankly, wants to get this up and running as quickly as possible. It's an important institution to ensure democratic accountability. And as soon as I know more, I will report it.
Senator Carignan.
Senator Carignan. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have an enormous number of questions. In fact, I'll start with the first one. Mr. Leader, the law is quite clear when it comes to enforcing this act. The emergency situation must come from a crisis of emergency and temporary nature, that it is not possible to use the existing system of Canadian laws to address, and that puts in danger the health, the safety, and security of Canadians, and is not under provincial power to address. So I'm trying to understand how you can be confirming to us that municipal, provincial, and Canadian laws that are currently in force did not make it possible to stop people on Wellington Street, to arrest them for mischief, and not just for that, but for the whole list of accusations that have been put forward. These are all provisions that exist, that are easy to enforce, and an officer of the peace is obligated to intervene on these provisions when the act in question has been committed. So I find it difficult to understand which Canadian provincial or municipal law was not capable of removing the protesters or towing trucks on Wellington Street.
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. The question is not just if, in the face of this Ottawa crisis, an act or a law exists or if the measures can be rolled out. The question is, can it be done effectively? Notwithstanding the fact that the City of Ottawa declared a state of emergency, notwithstanding the fact that the province of Ontario did the same, the facts on the ground were that police forces, even with reinforcements, were not capable of managing the situation. They were unable. And the measures that were put in place after the declaration of an emergency, including measures regarding funding and freezing funds, and including the ability to outline secured zones, and also including I'm looking for the word in French, the tow trucks, and including the right, which did not exist, to allow tow trucks to come and tow these vehicles. All of these measures were necessary. Why? Because on the ground, authorities at the municipal and provincial level, nor the police, were able to effectively manage the situation, notwithstanding their authorities. And this does fall under the criteria of this act, and the federal government deemed it necessary to invoke the act. Mr. Carignan, do you have another question? Can you put me on the second, third, fourth, and fifth lists for asking questions, please? Senator Carignan. I'm surprised by your answer when you say that these authorities were not capable. Let's take Ambassador Bridge, which was open a few days before the Emergencies Act was invoked. And the situation there was just about identical. There were truckers and a truck blockade. There was a call from our American neighbors asking if the bridge could be opened. Maybe that's what it would have taken here in Ottawa, too. But other than that, what is the difference? The difference between the solutions that police used for Ambassador Bridge, but that they couldn't use on Wellington Street. Senator Gold. There are a few different aspects to my answer. First of all, as I said in my speech and when answering questions, there were powers that neither the Canadian government or the Ontarian government had to remove the trucks that were part of the blockade to reopen the bridge. It took tow trucks from Michigan to do so. What is also important is the following. It is true that the government of Ontario took action on that issue, but we shouldn't speculate about discussions on that issue because discussions went on for some time. We don't want to speculate, and I insist that we do not speculate. Regarding Ambassador Bridge and the invocation of the Emergencies Act. But it is undeniable that the province of Ontario did not take much action to assist the local police to help them to act. And as I said, once again, tools were deployed, and we saw them here in Ottawa. These tools did not exist in the municipal or in the provincial laws, but those tools, those measures were indeed necessary to put an end to that, to blockade that illegal occupation. Senator Richards.
Next, you have a
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Thank you for your talk, Senator Gold, and thanks to the police. I have 7 police officers in my family, and I have 3 in my caucus who I respect a lot. It's funny, though, that the support for this legislation comes in good part from a party who, up until 2 years ago, many of their members wanted to defund the police. But I'm going to ask a question about your statement that the Indigenous wouldn't be subject to this legislation. Are these always to be considered a legitimate protest? And can an Indigenous protest become violent? And if not, what would constitute a violent protest? If the attempted derailing of trains and burning of police cars are never considered so. I think that reaches a level of violence. I'd just like you to comment on this, Senator Gold, please.
Sir Gold.
Well, thank you for your question. I'll go right to the question, not the comment on who supported it. All I said was, in my speech, Senator, was that people may be preoccupied and worried that future uses of the Emergency Act may target other groups. And I mentioned Aboriginal protests or environmental activists. Fact remains that if violent actions threatening the security of Canada cannot be dealt with effectively by existing laws or institutions, then and only then would at least one aspect of the underlying rationales for the Emergency Act be invoked. So if, in fact, a situation arose, regardless of who were committing the violent acts, and it met the criteria of the Act, again, not simply that it was unlawful. We have laws against crime. Not simply that it was violent. We have laws against violent crime. But such actions that cannot be effectively addressed by the jurisdictions by the laws in the jurisdictions that apply, then and only then would a government have the right to consider whether or not Emergencies Act could be applied, and if it had reasonable grounds, as the government does in this case, believes it has in this case, then and only then would the Emergencies Act an emergency be proclaimed, and then it would trigger the same kind of democratic process that we're engaged in right now. I hope that.
Senator Richards, you have a supplementary?
Yeah, I do very quickly, and I'll just preface it by saying that a few days ago, one of our reporters waded into the crowd in Wellington Street, and I'm glad the crowd was taken care of by the police. I'm not saying that I wanted them to continue this forever, but those at the network were appalled when he was called a Nazi. They said that someone called a Nazi maligning a person's character was appalling and horrendous. and I agree that it is appalling and horrendous to call people bigots and racists and misogynists. It's almost like calling, it's like calling a person a demon in Salem in 1640. There's no coming back from that. So I want to ask, are they right in saying the word Nazi and misogynist is an odious and sickening appellations when given with such whimsy to fellow Canadians? And does the easy stigmatization of so many people show a lack of moral fiber and a moral weakness in our government?
Senator Gold.
It is unacceptable to tar an individual or a person with a hurtful racial epithet. We would all agree. The fact remains that evidence of hateful symbols appeared and continue to appear not only here in Ottawa, but in other respects. It is not the case that it is not the position of the government that all protesters are Nazis or white supremacists. It has never been the position of the government. It is the position of the government, however, that this convoy, however well-intentioned it might be, and however well-intentioned many of the participants might have been, was nonetheless hijacked by extremist elements, and that's on the public record, of the white extremist groups funding it both in Canada and elsewhere, at the heart of organizing and mobilizing the convoys from the beginning. These are facts we cannot escape. They're uncomfortable facts. It is not to tar those who came with those attitudes, but it is nonetheless to affirm that once it was the act was proclaimed, and once a state of emergency was declared, and once activities were publicized as being unacceptable, that each and every person, whatever their particular views are, should have in fact left out of and obeyed the law. And it is regrettable that it took the invocation of the Emergencies Act and the strong presence of police officers from across the country to force that to happen.
Senator Boisvenu.
Senator Boisvenu. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Would Senator Gold accept another question? Yes. Senator Gold. Laws, the Emergency Act, comes in the wake of the War Measures Act that was only used 3 times in history. The 2 first times were not surprising, the First and Second World War, but the third time I lived through very closely, the October crisis of 1971. I was part of a university student association. You'll recall that in Quebec at the time, from the beginning of the 1960s, there were police operations that were intended to, or not police organizations, but an organization was intended to destabilize the Quebec government. They put bombs into mailboxes, and they participated in kidnapping. That of the kidnapping of the diplomat, Mr. Cross, and the Deputy Premier of Quebec, Pierre Laporte, who we know was these terrible facts today. Trudeau Sr. had decided to invade Quebec with the Canadian Army, and the police weren't left to deal with these odious crimes. And that's no wonder why that is no wonder why Prime Minister Mulroney changed this act so that it could be used in exceptional circumstances in consultation with the provinces and with the agreement of parliamentarians. And we know that with the current Act, those two criteria are not there. The majority of the provinces did not want it invoked on their territory. And we saw in the other place, two opposition parties oppose the use of this legislation. So there was not unanimity. So in my opinion, the current context is very different from the previous situation in 1970. And to invoke this act, it has to be followed with a justification. So my question is very simple. What is the current threat that justifies the invocation of the Emergencies Act? Did the RCMP have information that might be in the hands of these protesters? And how many of these protesters belong to terrorist groups? Thank you for the question. I was in Montreal, and I saw the army in the streets at the time. I had friends who were arrested. And as you clearly stated, the Emergencies Act has nothing to do with the old act, the old bill, and the actions taken on the ground that we saw here in Ottawa have nothing to do with it either. I attempted to explain all of the reasons why the government took the decision it did, and that it was reasonable. It was reasonable to believe that the declaration of a state of emergency under the Act was necessary. And the only thing I'd add to that, as I've said several times, is that I am not in a position to share here information either from our police forces nor from our intelligence services of their opinion that, or the opinion they may have provided to the government. But there are so many things that are already public that demonstrate that there were people not only on the margins of what was happening, but at the very heart of it, who are ready to use violence. They are prepared to encourage others to come to Ottawa to destabilize, if not topple our elected government, democratically elected. There are weapons. There are people who belong to racist groups, to extremist groups, and all of this is in the public record. So that's all that I can say. Once again, that according to the information that is public and that everyone is aware of, there was clearly enough evidence that the government had reasonable grounds to invoke the Emergencies Act. Senator Boisvenu. Thank you very much, Senator Gold. You used a word that, in my opinion, is contrary to this Emergencies Act. You said it was necessary, whereas the term that you should have used was that it would be mandatory, because in the current context, during the 24 days, no criminal acts were committed. I didn't see any criminal charges laid during those 24 days. And also, as my last question, what did the government do during those 24 days to dislodge these people? What physical, legal challenge did they put to these people other than having thought about it and taken the decision indeed to